Let's talk about the Green New Deal. It was one of the ideas that you're sort of most associated with. You were pushing it while you were working for AOC, and there was this sort of big upswell of momentum around the Green New Deal, people who got really excited about that. That time has passed somewhat, the sort of peak of the use of that term, of the sort of excitement around that term. There's a lot of kind of bleak feelings looking at what Trump is doing on environmental policy at the moment. Do you think that the Green New Deal as an idea, as a model, still has purchase now, can still motivate people in the same way, or has your thinking evolved since then?
Yeah. So I think it's good to actually step back to what was the Green New Deal actually trying to pitch? Because back then, when you looked at the world of solutions to climate change, there was basically a left that was really focused on stopping all fossil fuel infrastructure. And there was, the moderate solution, which was a tax on carbon. And what we were trying to say was that neither of these ideas actually solves climate change, first off. And secondly, they're both politically terrible. The tax on carbon, we saw what happened with the yellow vests in France. And if you just stop fossil fuel infrastructure, all you're going to do is raise fossil, gas prices and get a huge backlash to that. So the Green New Deal was really about how do we build all the clean energy industries that we need to build, which is really an upgrade, because all these clean versions of these industries are like the next generation version of it. I really see it as like America stuck on whale oil, while the rest of the world is moving on to fossil fuels and backering that revolution, right? And that's the approach China's taken to it, right? They were really just like saying, all right, this is the future. This is where the demand is. We're going to just invest like crazy to start building out, we're going to own the battery technologies. We're going to own the car, EVs. We're going to own all these industries. And it's this idea of of a nation acting sort of like a company in some ways, right? Like we're actually making bets on where we're going to get wealth from. That's how we used to act. That's how we built up all of our industrial base during the 20th century. So in a lot of ways, the Green New Deal was a political intervention, because the actual Green New Deal was like a 14-page resolution. It wasn't like a big plan for what to do. And what we were actually calling for when we did the sit-in, because AOC did the sit-in in Nancy Pelosi's office in her first day in Congress to call for the Green New Deal, we were calling for the Democrats to actually try to make the plan. And but what ended up happening through the political intervention was, this was during the time that the Democrats were running for president. The Democratic primaries were happening, and we got everybody running for president, through this inside-outside organizing movement. We're working with the Sunrise Movement to respond to a Green New Deal with their own versions. And it sort of succeeded in that. It succeeded in having everybody respond with a plan that was actually trying to talk about how do we invest to build up jobs, using a bunch of these industrial policy tools, which is a term that wasn't in use back then really, but we were trying to bring it back. And even Joe Biden responded with Build Back Better, which ended up being the Inflation Reduction Act, which ended up passing. And it wasn't everything I would have liked, but it was the largest investment in climate change in history, right? So I actually think we succeeded more than I expected in terms of creating real legislation through the act of just one act of political courage by one member of Congress, right? That's what was possible through that. So when you ask about like, what do we do now? I agree with you that, the Green New Deal got turned into a bunch of different things by a bunch of different people, and, the far right painted a certain way. But I think the core idea that we have to intentionally invest in and develop and upgrade our industries, that is the root of why we are stagnating as a country right now. We have to do that, and I don't care what you call it. That's the project I've been working on at New Consensus for the last 5 years. We've been calling it the Mission for America. It's a way more detailed plan for how do we actually upgrade and clean up all our industries to create all this wealth. Because at the end of the day, I think the project that we have to embark on is how do you invest to create wealth, to upgrade, to get to the next level in our society industry-wise, while at the same time tax the rich to fund a social safety net so everyone can have a decent living, right? Those are the two, that's the solution, I think. That's the opposition to the MAGA version, which is cut people out of our society so everyone has more. It's a zero-sum mentality.
Yeah, so I've got two follow-ups to that. Firstly, I guess speaking about like, building new infrastructure, building clean energy, building this sort of thing, I guess, some of the language that you use there, reminded me of some of the work around abundance that is happening at the moment. And, the work that Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson have been doing around how do you get that built. Now, you were on Ezra Klein's podcast talking about abundance, and, you were paired with a kind of left-wing critic of the idea. It's kind of been this flashpoint within the Democratic Party. I think largely because it was a bit paralyzed after the election. It didn't really have a vision of where to go next, and all of a sudden there was this one idea. So everyone's kind of latched on to like, let's talk about this one thing, right? But like, do you view the kind of abundance frame as being useful, positive, to get that conversation started about how to get these projects built, or do you worry about the direction that it's taken? Because there have been some groups within the Democratic Party who are more centrist or right leaning who have latched onto it as well. There's obviously this contestation around what it means and what it's going to be happening right now. So where do you see that landing, and are you hopeful or are you worried?
Yeah, it's funny because when we launched the Green New Deal, a lot of it was, I guess, quote unquote abundance. We were talking about creating energy abundance, building up a whole lot of wealth. But my sort of the way I approached the current abundance stuff, which came out in the Ezra Klein podcast a bit, is I agree with them on the goal. I absolutely think we should be trying to build towards a future where it's positive sum, where everyone has everything they need, right? Where I maybe have a slight critique is that a lot of their book just focuses on sort of procedural and permit reform and zoning regulations and things like that, which, I don't think they were trying to actually pitch a solution, but I just argue that that's definitely not going to be enough. Like if you actually look at the history of countries that did these rapid build outs, often under, social democratic governments or, progressive governments like we did in America, it was through these massive, massive investments, usually state-led. It was these comprehensive plans that people would pass, right? Like, or these countries would pass. It wasn't just like, we pass a policy here, we do a little tweak here, and we suddenly got a lot of wealth. We actually had to make plans to develop the country. We had to create institutions that would execute and finance those plans, which we used to have a bunch of in the US, but we got rid of all of them, so we don't even remember how to do it anymore. And we used to have leadership that was driving the country forward. Like anyone who's run a company knows you can't just like create a company handbook and hope that your product gets shipped, right? It actually takes execution and leadership and willpower to make this stuff happen. And so I just think it's such a bigger thing than just kind of what it's turned into, which is like this debate over permitting reform. And sure, we should, I think there should be permit reform. We talk about that in Mission for America. We have a bunch of examples of permit reforms that we propose. It's just like one thing. It's the same way that I sort of think like, Trump is like, we're going to bring manufacturing back to America, and we're going to do it with tariffs. Tariffs alone are not going to bring manufacturing back to America. It's like you have a hammer and so everything's a nail type of thing, right? And so that's my critique. And when you talk about, I know within the Democratic Party, it's turned into this like flashpoint of everyone's worried about who's going to latch on what idea to it. Like, is this just going to turn into Reaganomics? And if the whole abundance thing just does turn into neoliberal Reaganomics, then I think it's going to fail. And I think that's not going to create abundance, and it's just going to exacerbate our current issues with wealth inequality. Because when you look at what's keeping us from actually getting to abundance, a lot of the time the problem are these big corporations that put in all these regulations that hamstring the government against itself, so that they just capture the market as they have it right now, and they keep riding the gravy train. So I just think we actually have to. We have to think about this deeply, right? And actually propose real plans for it.
Yeah. Okay. So my second follow-up to your previous question was you mentioned the sit-in that happened on AOC's first day in Congress, where yourselves and a bunch of activists from the Sunrise Movement, occupied her office basically, try to get this on the agenda. Now, that obviously was at the time a kind of, confrontational form of activism that like she definitely wasn't used to. And the Democratic establishment generally was not, used to that way of doing politics. In Ryan Grimm's book, his account of this sort of period of history, which I think I've got on the shelf, like somewhere up here,
Nice.
you come across as, one of the people in the AOC camp who was like particularly kind of like gung-ho on like, let's push these ideas, let's shake up Washington, let's, kind of, grab them by the shoulders and shake them out of their ways and, try and do things differently. If you get elected, you won't have to deal with Pelosi, but, you'll have to deal with a whole lot of people who think a lot like Pelosi and do politics in her way, right? And
Yeah.
so how are you gonna either win them across or scare them, I guess, enough to to win over to your side?
I think a lot of this boils down to where are people at, because I do think there's been this change compared to 2018 to now. I think Trump getting elected again has made it so that a lot of people in the Democratic Party who were sort of like mainstream Democrats, right, have really they're really realizing that it's not just this fluke. Trump didn't just get elected by accident. Like there's something deeply wrong. There's something the Democratic establishment is doing wrong. And so I still have that approach. I'm a real practical guy, right? Like I'm very much a pragmatist. And I just think it's so impractical in a moment where we look at the numbers of the Democratic Party and they're just going down, down, down. We look at the way people are voting and we look at this hunger for change and we're not pitching that. So yes, I'm going to try to shake people by the shoulders and convince them, like I'll be giving them my persuasive arguments, but I think you do have to be okay with some confrontation and with saying the truths that people may not want to hear. And part of this is going to be what I do in Congress and how I interact with folks. And I think a lot of it boils down to you just need to actually be honest. I think people in Congress prefer you to be an honest person who's stating your opinions in your mind rather than someone who's like trying to appease everybody, but no one really knows where you stand and what you're trying to do. So I will be honest. But I'm also going to be recruiting people to primary other Democrats and to run in Republican districts and try to actually change this party because I think it's got to happen. I don't think if I convince Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries to suddenly adopt the Mission for America and go big, that's even going to be believable, right? I think the rest of the country won't believe that Hakeem Jeffries has suddenly realized, yes, our problem is that we're spending 12 hours a day calling big donors for money and not taking our job seriously. Because that's a big problem. That's what people do here in Congress. They spend all their time on the phone with big donors and not actually taking the job of legislating seriously. And I'm going to take the job of legislating seriously and making plans seriously.
Yeah. So I guess speaking about divisions within the Democratic Party and within Washington in particular, let's talk about Gaza for a second. The organization that you worked with Justice Democrats, to put in some of these progressive Democrats in winnable seats across the country, there has been a backlash to some of those candidates on the part of, particularly lobby groups who are supportive of Israel, and they were successful in unseating a few of those candidates who you initially got up. I'm talking about Jamal Bowman and Cori Bush, for instance. It's obviously like a live issue that's dividing some camps within the Democratic Party. So, how would you deal with that if you were elected, and how do you deal with it now when you're speaking to others within the Democratic Party who don't all agree on this particular issue?
Well, I think reality is catching up. I think right now, just the level of devastation in Gaza and what's happening there has made it so that the vast majority of Democratic voters and even the majority of voters in general in America want to stop sending arms and military aid to Israel, right? And they see I think the majority of Democratic voters see what's going on in Gaza as a genocide. So this is actually one of those issues where I think politicians are just completely out of step with where reality is. So I would say either realize where reality is, realize what's going on, realize that you don't need that money from the Israel lobby to keep winning your elections. And in fact, taking that money is probably a huge vulnerability now. So you should stop and start voting your conscience, right? Start voting for real, because that's ultimately what people want. I think voters are actually willing to accept some amount of disagreement from their representatives if they at least trust that the representative is voting, has some reason for why they believe that. That's not just I'm selling out to some lobby or I'm selling out to some corporations, right? And that's, I think, what's going on with the Israel issue. I think that's why there's such a divide in terms of like how many members of Congress would actually vote to stop military aid to Israel versus how many people would like that to stop.
When you worked in Washington, it seemed one of the main things that you were frustrated with was the sort of like the system and the way things work, even above and beyond the kind of actual substance of what you were dealing with.
It was less the system, because I have no issue with the rules and norms of Congress, right? And in fact, a lot of the fights we picked were specifically around trying to change some of the rules, but according to the rules, right? Like we were trying to tell the Democrats, hey, for example, the Democrats pass a rule package when they're in power, right? And in that rules package, we hamstring ourselves through these rules that we have like pre-negotiated away with the Republicans. And I was frustrated by the impracticality of that. Like, why in a negotiation do you negotiate against yourself before you even get to the table with the other side? That makes no sense to me as someone who's done a lot of negotiating in my life, right? So that's frustrating to me, is sort of the incompetence, right? I think the incompetence of and the movement of the Democratic Party, like we would have these Friday chiefs of staff meetings. And I actually don't know if Ryan Grimm talked about these in the book. The first one I went to, I thought, oh my God, what an opportunity. We got all the chief staffs for every member of Congress in one room. I'm sure this will be the meeting where we strategize how to fight back against Trump, right? Wrong. What we talk about in those meetings is we sent you guys a form last week. Have you guys filled it out? Right? We've got complaints. There's too many staffers in the members' elevators. So I just want to remind you, these petty rules that make no sense in the context of an authoritarian takeover. That's what pissed me off, right? That we're not taking it seriously. Trump said something crazy today. We'll do a press conference next week to address it with a strongly worded letter. Are you freaking kidding me? That's where we're at.
Yeah, you're not a fan of the like holding up paddles approach.
No. I take my country seriously. I really do. I take the moment we're in seriously, and I did not see the Democratic Party taking it seriously. That's what pissed me off.
Yeah, so I guess where I was kind of going with that question was like, it seems to me to be a frustration with different Democratic groups. This sort of like inertia created by a kind of proceduralism, or like a respect for norms or ways of doing things, internally within the Democratic Party that are unnecessary. Like, for instance, you brought up there, you're sort of negotiating away certain things before you get to the table. Something that, say, Ezra Klein brings up a lot is, the filibuster, for instance, and these sort of democracy reforms that, the Democrats have had opportunities to put forward, but they have chosen not to. I see a lot of crossover between the way that you are frustrated by the inability of the Democrats to sort of coalesce around, getting their shit together to get things done, in the same sort of frustration that you would see from someone like Klein, who's looking at, permitting reform or planning or whatever it is, and going like, why do these rules not allow us to just get the housing out, right? There seems to be this frustration at being sort of tied in knots by rules at the moment, right?
I share a lot of the same frustrations that he has, but I think it's not this adherence to rules. It's more of like a learned helplessness. Like what I saw in the party was just a lack of leadership or strategy. Like, what's the plan? Like, I'm okay with the rules if we're going somewhere. And we also have to recognize you're in Congress. You can try to change the rules. You don't have to. That's the point of Congress, is to try to pass the laws that we should have. So it's really weird to me to be in a position of power and be like, oh no, what can we do? Why? Why are you there? Why are you there? And I think it's really this sort of careerism. Like, I really do think part of it is people get into Congress because of their strength of fundraising, and that's what their job is. They see their job as fundraising every day, and they take a break to do some legislating and whatever, and then they go back to fundraising. Whereas I think the job right now is to actually figure out what the heck to do. What should we actually be doing?
Podcast if you want. It's
okay, thank you. Yeah, I don't know. I'm on a British podcast. I don't know how polite you guys are, but so to me, it's not really this rules adherence. It's like, I feel like I'm working at Kodak, and the digital camera revolution is happening right now, and everyone's just busy filing TPS reports. That's what's going on.
Yeah, interesting. So I guess maybe to round things out with that kind of innovation, and can we just move a little bit faster and break a few more things, perhaps not going in the full Zuckerberg direction there, but I guess to bring things back to San Francisco, where you're running. As outsiders, a lot of us, when we think of San Francisco at the moment, are thinking about what's going on in tech, and as we sort of started with this discussion, that's sort of in a pretty right-leaning direction. But as you mentioned, there's a lot of just ordinary workers in the tech industry and in other industries in San Francisco, who aren't represented by that. And I guess there are a lot of people, particularly who have, housing concerns. It's known for being an expensive housing market, for instance. What are your key messages to appeal to, ordinary San Franciscans? And speaking to an international audience now, what sort of, face of San Francisco would you like to see put to the world that is perhaps not at the moment?
Yeah, in San Francisco, the big issue here is cost of living. It's the cost of our housing, cost of our electricity bills. A lot of what I talk about, because I'm running for Congress, I'm not running for mayor, is how a lot of the issues we're facing in San Francisco, we see them all across the country, and we actually won't be able to solve them by ourselves. So you look at the skyrocketing cost of healthcare, which is one of the biggest expenses in our city budget, and one of the reasons why we're starting to cut services from our city budget. That's something we actually have to solve. So I think we've just spent decades ignoring these huge challenges because they're politically difficult. And now we're at the place we're at, right? And I think when I look at the utility bills, this is a very local issue because in San Francisco, we're actually supposed to have a publicly owned utility. And Sacramento, just close to us, has a publicly owned utility, and they pay 40% less than we do in electricity bills, right? But the reason we can't do it is PG&E, our utility, has bought off the politicians. And so we're like, no politician is willing to go up against them and try to enforce this law, because there's actually a law that says we should have a publicly owned utility in San Francisco. So stuff like that is what I talk about in San Francisco. At the end of the day, we have to actually make this city and this country affordable for the vast majority of people who live here. Otherwise, people are going to keep voting for more and more radical change, whatever flavor that might take. And I don't want to become more of an authoritarian flavor.
Yeah, interesting. As we were talking about just before we started recording, that sounds like a somewhat Mamdani-esque message of, a sort of relentless focus on cost of living as, a potential winning message for Democrats.
Yeah, I do think that is a big winning message in places like San Francisco and New York. I'd say if you're campaigning in the Midwest, for sure, it should be combined with how do you also build up industries in all of these towns that have just really stopped developing, because I grew up in Texas, and Texas is doing okay in a lot of places, but not in a lot of other places. And so I do have this perspective that kind of combines a bit of both of those experiences in my life.
Well, it's going to be a tough race, but best of luck with it. Saikat Chakrabarti, thanks for joining the Prospect Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect Podcast. To listen to the episode in full, including further discussion and our weekly banger and dud section, click the link in the description below. And to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.